Hi, I'm John sti憐with the Coquille Valley Sword Group, and today we're going over Article 4 of the Heiau Sajiku Kasho. So, let's begin. Article 4, the posture. The posture should be so that the face is not directed at the floor, but also not too far upwards, and both shoulders should be neither stiff nor slouched. At the same time, the stomach should be pushed forward instead of the chest. Do not bend the hips, do not stiffen the knees, and the straight body should be turned towards the face of the enemy so that it appears wider. It is necessary to always behave so that the everyday posture is the same as it is during combat, and that the fighting posture is the same as it is in everyday life. This should be carefully observed. So, we've gone over Teinouchi, and now we're looking at Taitsubaki, basically, the basic structure of the body. And it starts off pretty simply, saying that the face should not be pointed at the floor. Well, what does he mean by this? Basically, whereas in other styles, which will sort of isolate the chin and neck from the rest of the torso and point it downward, in Hyoho we don't do this. Now there are some Koryu that do this. They will take the gaze and lower it. They're still working with that idea of Inzan no Metsuke, the eyes of the distant mountain. But from their reckoning, it's more important to be able to really see an opponent's feet as kind of an indicative clue as to where they're going, especially since the strategy of moving your feet and thus your body first before you strike is so prevalent because it's efficient, right? In Hyoho, we don't do this. We also don't try and bring our head up higher than normal. In the Gorin no Sho, Musashi talks briefly about striving for height over your opponent, and a lot of people misconstrue this as like literally trying to get your nose over top of the person, and this is just simply not the case. What we're going for with all of this is a good, stable platform that allows us the ability to respond to our situation and to act on it in a way that's supported, rather than sort of weak and flopping around. Which is not to say that pointing your head at the ground is a bad tactic. It's just something that we do not employ in Hyoho. So next he talks about the shoulders, right? Now, the shoulders and this idea of the body being wide is sometimes really misunderstood. People will try and engage kind of their chest and shoulders and push their shoulders out wide with sort of muscular effort, and this is not what we're after at all, right? Of course, we don't want the shoulders slouched, right? We don't want this sort of concavity, right, of form, but we don't want the shoulders unnecessarily rigid and pulled back or sort of pressed out to the side. Both of these, the concavity and convexity, warp the upper and mid back, and that aside from just wasting energy and creating excess tension, decreasing motion in the body, you're corrupting your basic sort of skeletal posture, and that makes your work harder. So what is it that we're going for with our shoulders, right? We want our shoulders to be full, right? I know that's maybe not necessarily helpful, but if you imagine that sort of your upper body is a balloon, right? Your shoulder, chest, back cavity, and it expands outward, right? Right? And it's got sort of that feeling as though it's just pressed out a bit. You're not trying to intentionally stretch yourself in any one direction, but rather you just gently expand, it'll make more sense, right, as you practice. Next, talks about the stomach preceding the chest. What do we mean by that? If you've ever been, in an altercation with a dude or lady, you know that it often starts with this sort of, I call it roostering, right? Or it's like, what, right? And this sort of chest expansion, like, right? People trying to make themselves look bigger, more intimidating. And then when the fight begins, because that focus is already up top, already sort of in their mind, in their doing stuff bits, right? It tends to precede a person's work. In contrast, in Hyoho, because of how we shape the spine, and this is not unique to Hyoho, most Asian martial arts do this, our hara, our core, leads the way. Let's see if we can get this kind of an image. So, now it's got to come up a little bit. His technical difficulties. So, we've got our body. In the form that we want to avoid, the chest or the face leads, right? If you want to get your face cut, stick it out there for some dude and he will oblige. What we're going after is that straight lower back, and doing that naturally puts my belly and my hara in front of my chest, even though when I stand straight, they're sort of flush with each other. Now, this is not an artificial expansion of the belly. In other words, I'm not like bulging out my stomach, right? But instead, my stomach leads because of my posture, so that as I move, I'm driving with the hara. Now, this there's a lot going on here, actually. In Hyoho, we don't typically directly oppose a person's work. In other words, when someone makes a motion against us, we don't try and halt that motion. We also don't tend to just try and, if the attack's coming here, just throw that motion off in some haphazard direction. One, because to do that, you've got to be stronger and in a better physical position, sort of structurally, to do that. And if the other guy is bigger than you, he wins by virtue of his weight, or the weight of his sword, or the superiority of his structure. And we want to try and mitigate those advantages as much as we can. The other is that it gives feedback to the opponent, right? The moment that they receive some kind of anything in their swing, it's getting information to them. They're reassessing, and they're trying to work from there. So we want to avoid that as much as possible. Now, in the kata, you will see dome, what look to be straight blocks that, in the kata definitely stop the person's cutting motion by directly opposing it. But this is kata. It's not fighting. It's different, right? And when we get into the Nito Seiho, where this appears more prevalently, we'll talk about the specifics of what's going on in the kata, why it's doing that, versus how it's used at a proficient level, or even a very, very high level of technical skill. Suffice it to say, we don't like to just stop people's work. We like to go around it, right? Because it is both harder to detect and harder to oppose. So a classic example of this is when I'm teaching students to move from Gedan into Chudan with the long sword. once they've got sort of the basic driving motion, I'll come to them and I'll stand to one side of them and I'll create a rigid abutment to the bicep of their lead arm. I'm not leaning into it. I just make a wall touching it right there so that they cannot easily push through me, right? And then I'll have them go into chewed on. Now, if they're making the motion correct, it goes around the force. Sort of difficult to demonstrate here, but it creates this sort of drive up, around, and through. They'll still feel the pressure, but it doesn't impede their motion at all. In contrast, most of the time, because this quality of motion is something that I feel is common in Coquille. I've seen it in lots of people's work from different schools, so I'm assuming it's fairly common. But it is one of the main points of advantage that a lot of sort of contemporary arts simply don't have and don't understand and don't even know it's there. And because it is not intuitive for the body, people don't tend to accidentally stumble on it. It's something that usually has to be specifically taught and pointed out, and you have to practice it a bit to make it sort of commonplace for your body's motion. So what tends to happen is they'll go and they'll hit that abutment and they won't be able to move through it, right? They'll try and push it, they'll try and fall or slip their arm off of it. But what we're really looking for is that ability to, when faced with something that's stopping you, to be able to go over and around it without meaningfully altering your structure or the structure of your opponent. This is one of those things that is basically impossible to write about, and I can talk about it. It's not going to necessarily make it much clearer, except to kind of be like a coin at the bottom of the well. You can kind of vaguely hear that something's down there, but you have to investigate on yourself. It really takes a lot of person-on-person contact to begin to understand this. So there's that. And this quality of, with your tail tucked and your hara sort of in front of your chest, and your hara leading the motion, bringing your whole body with you, but having it be kind of the central engine of power, it instills that same quality of motion into your walking. Again, without your hand on somebody to feel it, it can be kind of tricky. Though, Kuroda Tetsuzan from the Kuroda has put out lots of videos on YouTube, and he is, I think, particularly adept, if you watch his Tai Tsubaki, in look at it with the idea of looking for this moving around and through their pressure rather than just butting against it, and you might be able to see it easier there. Anyway, moving on. Now, Musashi talks about this sort of hara type motion in the Gorin no Sho a little bit in a section where he labels it as wedging out. And a lot of people, because the section itself specifically focuses on, or it doesn't even focus, it mentions vaguely drawing your weapon, people have assumed, again, as people I've talked to, have assumed that this is something that is only done when drawing a weapon. So if you don't know, the tools of the samurai are worn basically between sheets of fabric. There's very rarely any kind of like mechanical fixation that holds them in place. Now, if I have a tanto and the saya for the tanto slipped in here, and I just pull it, it comes right out, right, as easily as it went in. The idea of wedging out is to push your belly out to literally wedge the tool between the different layers of your obi, right? Normal, sort of wedged. Right. Now, what Musashi is saying there and here, or what he's driving at, is this notion that by just having good posture and that sort of strong band, you can do the work and get kind of all of these benefits all at once. And he's using that wedging out as an easy way, an easy gauge for people, kind of a touchstone for them to be able to think about where on their body are they controlling, what are they doing. As always, it takes practice to get into the habit of working with your tail tucked all the time, but it's pretty worth it. So next, don't bend the hips. This does not mean, or rather, what this means is a lot of people will bend at the hips, working from sort of this lower sort of sacroiliac space. Instead, what we want to do in Kyoho is to bend from the hips, so all the way back, taking the hips with us, rather than leaving the hips locked and bending away from them, right? It's pretty simple, pretty easy, doesn't take a whole lot. The next bit is to not stiffen the knees, obviously. Just don't lock your knees. It's pretty self-explanatory. Now, making the body broad. We talked about this a little bit, to say that you're not trying to sort of stretch with your shoulders and chest. That's not the case. And honestly, this idea of the broad body is covered in a couple different places, but it's one of those things that people really tend to mistake a lot. Think of it as 30% physical, 70% psychological, right? We want to be broad in our form. In other words, we want to face the opponent quite squarely, both as a facet of our psychological sort of control that we're trying to exert on the opponent, and as a sort of tactical ornament that we have this idea of collapse. In other words, if you're straight, right, straight back, and someone pushes backwards, you have a little bit of give before you have to step. Same thing if someone pushes you forward, you have a little bit of give, and then you have to step. If you fight like this and someone pushes you forward, you have no give. You have no collapse left in your form, and it breaks down. Same thing rearward, right? This applies not only sort of vertically, but in terms of width and broadness. So if I have one shoulder all the way back and someone starts to apply work on that shoulder, I've got no room left in my position to be able to absorb it through just my sort of interior spaces, right? And so a person can bring me down and begin to work on me that way. So by having it square, I can be pushed or pulled in either direction in kind of a wide range, almost 90 degrees, maybe a little bit more, before I am forced to start stepping to avoid corrupting my posture. This is not just a defensive tool. We also use it offensively, right? By creating a broad image, the opponent attacks, and with very little motion, we become a much thinner section, right? This is somewhat similar to the idea of the folding screen or the folding door that Musashi talks about, both in this and I believe in the Gorin no Sho. But you've seen it in the kata, right? You've seen it in sasen, you've seen it in hasso, you've seen it in ukinagashi, right? So practice and you'll figure it out, right? I will mention though that this broad body, narrow body, they are linked to that underlying inyo, right? That we're full, bright like the sun, we're controlling, and then all of a sudden we become that shadow. We become the moon, right? And it's the sooner you start to view the concepts that Musashi talks about in this sort of inyo, yin-yang kind of cooperative duality way, sort of schema, the sooner you'll start to really understand the why behind why we're moving the way we do, why we work the way we do. And for some people that will sound like, oh, your fighting method is based on a philosophical concept only, and you have contorted practical work to fit in the mold of that philosophical idea. And that's not the case so much. Actually, it's almost backwards. In other words, you have the fighting concepts that you observe are functional, and you use them, and from that you naturally begin to try and assess, well, what made technique A work and technique B fail, right, consistently? Oh, well, you do this enough and you begin to observe these sort of underlying principles, right? And for us, the principles that we really work from and in is this duality, right? Inyo, goju, right? Hard and soft. So it's helpful. Now, the last part, right? The whole, your body in a fight should be the same as it is in your everyday life, and your everyday life should be the same as it is in the fight thing. If you take away one thing from this section, this should be it, right? This should be that gem, because it allows you a quick metric to gauge how close your work is to the reality, or not to the reality, to what Musashi is trying to teach, right? Now, obviously, this does not mean that, I'm going to walk around with my arms in jodan. Well, hi, Bob, I'd like to buy some bread today. Of course not, right? However, if I drop those directly combative elements, right, and I just move, I'm broad, my back is in good format, right? My head is neither too high nor too low, my knees are relaxed, my tail is tucked, then I'm developing a posture, the posture of both fighting and day-to-day life as one unified thing. And there are a lot of benefits to doing it this way, but I'm just going to speak about the practical ones in terms of conflict, right? I have taught self-defense and martial arts for over 20 years, and it almost always comes down to people fight the way they live, right? What they carry with them all day long, how how they move in their mind and how they move with their body is what they do under stress. They just do it worse, right? So by refining our casual state, the state at which we're sort of always at, and making it more efficient, both for its job in that casual setting and in sort of conflict, we're getting so much extra training, right? It's not, oh, well, I learned how to walk, for an hour and a half once a week for 5 years. Now I'm a master swordsman. It's like, well, that's great. You compare that to 40 years of your life, and it really, one of those trainings is what's going to take over, and it's not going to be your good footwork. So, that's why we in Hyo-ho really advocate this sort of naturalistic approach, not extreme, not fanatical, just working as simply as humanly possible, right? No special stances, good posture. Posture that is good in fighting and good in everyday life, right? And there's a lot more to that. Let's say that you're watching these videos and you're interested in studying Hyo-ho and you're sort of doing this on your own or with a small group of friends. You can use this as a metric for your own kamae. Go, okay, well, I'm in Hasso or Geidon or whatever. If you drop those combative elements, can you just walk around like that? Is it a position that you can readily move normally in, right? Or are your knees too bent? Are you sort of duck walking? Is your back all like weird and cricked? Are you leaning way far forward or way far back, right? Use it as a guide, right? And as always, he says, this should be carefully observed, which we've sort of talked about in previous videos. This composure of the body is the foundation for all the stuff that we do. Good posture is what lets us move. Good posture is what lets us react to an opponent's attack, to drive our own work, right? To resolve the unexpected, or to be able to manipulate not only our bodies but our opponents as well. Everybody is always looking for, right? They come to class, they want to do the Nito Seo. They want to do 2 swords. They want to swing around. They want to be like some flashy, super mall ninja. The basics, right? Everybody says it, and so few people listen to it. The basics are what matter. Good posture, good psychological state, good motion, right? Breathing, right? Most people who don't have sort of conflict experience are shit when it comes to their breath, right? They don't breathe, and they lock up, and their endurance goes from 100 to nothing, in 30 seconds, and then they just get beat, right? So, focus on your basics, and don't be in a rush so much. Like, this stuff, it takes time to sort of germinate inside you. It has to dwell for a little bit and kind of suffuse your body, suffuse your mind, really permeate who you are, how you are, and what you do, to get the value of it. I mean, of course, you can go, oh, well, I saw Jujidome, right, and I'm going to apply that with my whatever techniques, playing with boffers with my friends or whatever. That's fine. But it's not the same as getting the whole breadth of it, right? Not worse, just not the same. So, I'll get off my soapbox. As always, if you guys want to understand this, you have to pick up a sword and go train.